Good afternoon. Today we have the honor and privilege of having Mr. Ozcan Keles with us. Mr. Ozcan Keles will talk about making dialogue effective. Ozcan Keles is a non-practicing barrister and member of the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn. He is the chairperson of the Dialogue Society since 2008 and was the executive director of the Dialogue Society and the executive editor of the peer-reviewed biannual Academic Journal of Dialogue Studies from 2008 to 2014, and a PhD candidate in human rights at the University of Sussex since 2015. Ozcan is also a member of the Sussex Centre for Conflict and Securities Research. Between 2006 and 2009, he was a research student with Kevin Boyle at the Human Rights Centre of the University of Essex, where he held the Scholarship Award of 2006. Ozcan was called to the bar in 2005 after successfully completing the bar course at the Inns of Court School of Law. My apologies for that. He obtained his LLM in Human Rights Law from SOAS, University of London, in 2002. His academic interests include Islamic knowledge production, social movement practice, Islam and human rights, freedom of religion or belief, women's rights, British Islam and the Hizmet movement, violent extremism, dialogue and dialogue studies. You're welcome, Mr. Ozcan Keles. You have up to 2 hours for this session, but you can finish it early too, and it's totally up to you however you like to conduct it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bethsat, for that introduction. And hello to everyone from wherever you are joining us from. I understand that this is, we have a number of people from different parts of the world, so it's a privilege for me to be joining your course on dialogue studies and to offer my humble insights and reflections. As I explained to Bethsat, I've been doing a PhD now for 5 years on Islam and human rights and social movement practice. So I have been slightly removed from the dialogue scene in that period. But nonetheless, I am here and will try to offer my reflections on the panel as and the module as titled. Now, the title of this particular presentation. Oh, by the way, if you have any questions, as I explained in the introduction, I intend this to be a reflective talk in the sense that I don't have a lecture that I will be reading from, and although I like to believe that I know what I'm talking about slightly, I'm not entrenched in my views, and I want to think about them as I'm delivering them to you. Also, because it's been a number of years since I've been talking about dialogue, so coming back to it, I want to think about some of the points that I'm making. So I'm happy to revise and rethink and reflect, and please feel welcome to jump in and make comments and say what you want to say. It doesn't have to be, and I don't intend it to be, a sort of a formal lecture, if you like. The title, Making Dialogue Effective, this is in fact a panel discussion that we ran at the Dialogue Society here in London from 2010 to 2011. This was 6 panels, and we invited a group of dialogue practitioners in London, professional dialogueurs, if you like, or dialogue practitioners who are running interfaith, intercultural dialogue organizations, as well as others, academics as well, to talk about how we can make dialogue effective and if dialogue can be thought of in those terms. I'm happy to say that we have a publication that summarizes these seminars, these panels, as well as the recommendations that we sort of extrapolated from the discussion. So you can go on to the Dialogue Society website and go into our publications, and if you want to look at it, you will find it there. Now, before we jump in, I think it's just important to provide a bit of context as to why we undertook that particular subject matter. At the Dialogue Society, we had and we continue to have a number of advisors, and these advisors come from different backgrounds, different faith traditions, and one in particular who describes himself as a militant atheist. So he says, I'm a militant atheist. You know, it's curious that he is on the board, or was on the board, of the Dialogue Society for many, many years. He subsequently, he remains a friend of the Dialogue Society, but subsequently asked to be removed for different reasons unrelated to us and his relationship with us. But his criticism and skepticism was this. He was like, well, you know, we are good people, you are good people. I like your company, I enjoy your company. But what does dialogue really achieve? I mean, what are we doing here, right? We have limited resources, limited time, limited energy. And, you know, while it's very enjoyable and useful and intellectually stimulating to be together, what does dialogue really achieve? Because if you look at the dialogue industry, and there is this term now, dialogue industry, and perhaps we are contributing to the creation of an industry, Basad, you know, by focusing on dialogue as a discipline in and of itself. And well, when you do that, it creates a bubble. You know, we talk about the Westminster bubble in London, where the politicians are in Parliament, the Houses of Commons, Houses of Lords, and, you know, all the politicians that are around that, the think tanks, there's a bubble. And similarly, there, you know, can be a bubble, and some would argue there is a bubble around the dialogue industry or dialogue practitioners. And, you know, if you look at the scene here, it's mainly, I don't want to generalize, but that, you know, the nature of the beast, it is generally white, middle class, slightly old. So you'd be hard pressed. I mean, you do get younger people, but you're mainly looking now at professionals and middle class people who are in their sort of mid 40s to mid 50s, who sort of comprise that, who have a university degree, well educated, that type of people. And his criticism and his point was, well, you know, it's great. These are people that like to engage with other people. They like to travel. They read. And therefore they expose themselves to different ideas. And if they want to engage in dialogue, then so be it, let them engage in dialogue. But what are we solving here? You know, what about the people that actually deprive themselves and homogenize themselves and stick within their own groups and ghettos? And if you look at racism and xenophobia, prejudice and stereotypical thinking, you'll find that often that it grows and develops in the midst of those people that are sort of hostile to dialogue, or if they're not actively hostile to it, they're not in an environment that precipitates it, and therefore they are less likely to engage in it, and they're less likely to attend these events, especially interfaith dialogue events. You know, faith doesn't do it for people in the UK to a large extent. Again, I'm aware that that's a massive generalization, but while the UK is not as secularized as continental Europe, faith and theology are not issues that exercise the popular mind, if you like. So when you do anything around faith, you're likely to get a group of people that are interested in those kind of topics, which brings us back to the point about, you know, mixing with the same crowd, and therefore expending a great deal of energy for achieving what. So that was his criticism and skepticism, and it was a point that we wanted to explore, because at the Dialogue Society at the time, and still, we were trying to figure out what it is that we're trying to do. And I think it's really important that whatever organizational structure you are in, you always have your eye on this question of, okay, what am I doing in the short term, but also what is this all supposed to mean? So with that view in mind, we organized this panel discussion, and we brought together these people, and we started to probe this. And I'm going to talk, I can't talk about all of them, but there's sort of 4 headings or 4 panels that I'll sort of expand a little bit. Does that make sense in terms of, you know, the context? Does anybody want to jump in and say anything about that? I mean, do you have similar thoughts? Have you encountered this in your own lives, in your own experiences? Feel free to jump in and make comments if you wish to. Or you might disagree. Look, this is one perspective from London, from where you are, from where you're seeing. In fact, dialogue may be, you know, a very attractive, exciting form, term, and approach. So if you don't think that that's the case, then feel free to say so. But I'll move on. So when we look at the first panel, the title was Effectiveness in Intercultural and Interfaith Dialogue. Can it be defined? How do we measure it? Now, I'm sure I've looked at some of the discussions that you've already have had, and clearly, you've already discussed the definition. So I'm not going to say a great deal about that. But whenever we talk about effectiveness and we try to define something or measure it, we need to go back to the first basics and look at what are we talking about. Especially in an academic setting, we need to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So dialogue here, is often its etymological meaning is meaning through words, to achieve meaning through words, and often that is taken as the spoken word. But the broader meaning, because if we take that meaning achieved through words, if we take that on its own, then a great deal of dialogue activities, in fact, cease to be dialogue, because there are, for example, activities. They are sporting events, they are cultural events where meaning is not necessarily shared through the spoken or the written word, but it is shared through the everyday practices of people coming together around an event. And in my experience, traveling with people, for example, on an interfaith event, or engaging on an interfaith picnic where you go and sit and eat with people and play some football or some volleyball, can be a great way of actually breaking down the ice, a great way to see each other and to humanize each other, right? And who's to say that's not dialogue? So the definition that we adopt at the Dialogue Society is broader than the one that I just provided, and it's something along the lines of a range of activities through which people of different social, cultural, and religious groups come together for meaningful interaction and exchange. This at least was the definition, the working definition that we had for dialogue at the time. In terms of effective, and again, that's one of the other terms in the question or in the panel heading, effectiveness in intercultural and interfaith dialogue. What do we mean by that? And the term effective is often associated with it's a managerial term, right? It's to maximize the outcome of something, doing something to obtain a particular outcome. The problem that our panelists had with this, and sort of we had with this particular term, is what does this do for the nature of dialogue? Are we instrumentalizing dialogue to obtain a particular outcome? So if effectiveness is to maximize the outcome of something, as you would talk about in managerial terms, how can we make this more effective? Or now that we have the vaccination, what's the term there? Efficacy, isn't it? Efficacy is effectiveness and efficiency. I don't know what it is in the in vaccine terminology, what it's the specific meaning there, but generally and the dictionary meaning of efficacy is effectiveness and efficiency. So it's a term that looks towards the outcome of the activity that is being conducted. And in an office environment or in a corporate environment, it is about maximizing profit. It is about pushing down your costs. It is about meeting your targets. It is about all of those things. And there's a tension here, because the dialogue in itself, in fact, when you look at the definitions of dialogue and the discussions of dialogue places an emphasis on the process of dialogue rather than the outcome of dialogue. Yankeliewicz's formal definition of dialogue is, he refers to a genuine dialogue, and that would be defined as dialogue in which participants are able to suspend inequality and coercive influences, to listen with empathy, seeking understanding, and to bring assumptions into the open. So it's to achieve to be present in the moment, to listen attentively, to suspend your judgment, and to obtain a high level of understanding, to understand the other, to empathize with the other, and to perhaps travel in the shoes of the other, to see the world as that person sees it. So when we say, okay, so if we apply the term effective to that, so if we say, okay, let's if that's the aim of dialogue, how can we apply the term effective to that? And so there are things that you could do, because if you want to suspend judgment, if you want to understand each other, if you want to listen attentively, well, there are things that you could do to make that possible. You could be calm. Unlike myself, I have a sort of baseline of talking at a certain pace, of moving my arms and limbs a lot when I talk. It's just the way that I am. So if I met somebody for dialogue for the first time and I spoke to them as I normally speak, that person might mistake my animated speech pattern for being nervous or excited, and that might then put that person at unease. So one way of engaging in dialogue would be to talk to the person in advance so that he could establish a baseline in relation to my behavior, right? Another way would be, for if you're engaging in dialogue, to take a moment to remind yourself what you're about to do, to be present, to switch your phone off, which so that you are present and that you are less agitated, because those are inhibitors to engaging in a form of dialogue, as we've explained. It's also about creating an environment where that dialogue can occur. So thinking about your physical environment, thinking about the seating arrangement. So, you may sit at the head of the table at your dining room at home, which is fine. But if you're engaging in a dialogue with somebody else and you sit them around your boardroom table and then you sit at the head of the table, well, what does that say about power dynamics, right? Are you putting that person at ease, at comfort, or is there a reason that you're doing that? That you are yourself perhaps are not so much aware of. To be aware of the discourse that you're employing, the questions that you're asking, because by definition, the questions that we ask and include in our dialogue, by definition, excludes other questions. So what does that say, and how does that reflect upon the participants in the dialogue? Apologies for the noise in the background. We are still in lockdown in London, and we are still homeschooling, and I have 4 children. I have a 4-year-old, 5-year-old who was 5 recently, and a 2-year-old. So apologies if you hear screaming and shouting in the background. It is what it is. And the language, for example. So we're speaking in English now. Obviously, that's the language of the course, perhaps. But there's also something to be said about that. And how that plays into the power dynamic. So there are ways that you can think about creating an environment where you have the ability to be able to be present and to listen and to understand. This is the argument that was, and this is the discussion that occurred on these panels. Anything that goes beyond that, anything that instrumentalizes dialogue beyond what I've just sort of set out for you, was considered to be too prescriptive. So we are giving dialogue an objective beyond what dialogue should have. And the argument was, as I say, genuine dialogue requires space, and controlling the outcome of dialogue is at the cost of dialogue itself. Now, there is a point about that which is quite interesting, because dialogue in itself, if we take dialogue in the way that I described at the outset, where I said dialogue is actually not just about the communication of the written and the spoken word, and don't think of dialogue as discursive, right? Think of dialogue as a form of practice. So when people engage in dialogue, what do? What are their bodily functions? Practice is, let's define practice, okay? So practice is meaningful, recursive, bodily actions. Meaningful, recursive, bodily actions. So you brush your teeth in the morning, it's recursive, you do it, you don't just do it once, so you do it every morning, every evening. It has a meaning, so you're not doing, it's not a twitch, it's not what's the term, a reflex that you can't control. It's something that you do for a purpose, even if you're not always thinking of that while doing it, but underlying it has a meaning. So there's meaning, it's recursive, and it involves bodily action. Another way of defining it is the combination of doings and sayings, right? So practice, when you go on a picnic, for example, what does it involve? If you look at it and you break it down, you see that people are organizing, they're calling, they're printing leaflets, they're giving that out, they're then preparing food, they're meeting people there, they're shaking hands, perhaps not so now, but they're greeting one another, they're sitting down, they're talking, they're making small talk, then they're making more engaging talk, then they're playing football. So in fact, dialogue is a form of practice. And the speeches, even if like, let's look at the speech thing a bit more. So if you look at speech, that is also a form of practice, right? Because there are certain things that you do before a speech. You prepare for it. You make some notes. You stand up at the lectern. You talk. You listen. There is a certain interaction, even if it's not spoken. There is an interaction in the room with the way that the people are listening or not listening. So there is a form of practice, and practice theories. Practice-based studies, practice-based epistemologies. These are new sort of growing bodies of academic literature that claim that, in fact, our life, meaning, knowledge is all, in fact, created and determined by practice. So it's not about we think in our minds, we obtain knowledge in our brains, in our heads up here, and then practice is just the application of that. In fact, what this new development, it's not a discipline in itself, it's in fact a turn in social theories. What this says is that, in fact, practice creates meaning, it determines and creates knowledge, context, and sense, and sensibility. And so practice is not the afterthought. In fact, it is the priori. It is that which comes first. And so if you think of it, and one of the things that it says, which is quite interesting, it says that there is a distinction between practice and practitioner. Right? We often think of practice as the product of the practitioner. Okay, so the practice, it's almost like the practitioner's child. So a practitioner, creates an object, and that thing belongs to him or her. And therefore, the practitioner can speak on behalf of the practice and can tell you what this practice is all about. Well, practice theories says no, actually, practice and practitioner are distinct. Practice has a logic which is not that of the practitioner. I'm quoting you here from practice theorists. Practice has its own trajectory, okay? So practice will develop in ways that the practitioner did not necessarily intend, or the practitioner was not necessarily aware of, or even agree with, okay? And there are examples of this, of practice developing in ways. And sometimes we refer to this as the unintended law, the law of unintended consequences. You know, we wanted to do one thing, but we ended up doing something else. Well, that's because practice has its own logic. And if dialogue is a practice, then it has its own logic. And so as the practitioners, we can't be too prescriptive. It's a bit like, and let's go back to the analogy with having children. If you have children and you want to determine that your children's future, you want to say, well, you should become a doctor, you should become a lawyer. And, you know, parents will sometimes, you know, be over domineering, and they want to prescribe the route and life of their children. Well, what do the children do? They often rebel. They say, no, I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do. I want to do something else. So it's very similar. Your child has his or her own logic and intent and purpose and meaning. Even a 2-year-old, I have a 2-year-old who plays Minecraft, who still wears his nappies, but who has a will of his own. And you can, I don't want to take the analogy too far, but you can think of practice in those terms. Practice has its own spirit, and therefore it needs to, the more you can try to prescribe it, you can try to curtail it, but that doesn't do you any good, and it doesn't do the practice any good. In fact, the best thing to do is to sort of try to support the practice as it develops, as it grows, to see where it leads, and to recognize, and with humility to recognize that actually it's not yourself necessarily that's determining this, because another part of practice is that it is social. It is something that you do in collectivity with other people. Okay. Yeah, and if dialogue is a practice in the terms that I've just described, then it will develop according to its own trajectory. So we can try to saddle it with purposes and objectives and outcomes and effectiveness criteria that we think are appropriate, but we have to be aware and open to the idea that in fact it may not occur and develop in those terms. It may take on a different way, and in fact that's the argument for taking a less prescriptive approach, and in fact take a step back from the practice and try to allow it to develop and to support it in its own trajectory. Why? Again, if your child has a musical talent and you want your child to become a doctor, well, if she or he does not enjoy medicine, then the chances are they're either going to be miserable doctors, make themselves miserable, make their patients miserable. They're not going to be able to qualify because they don't enjoy what they do. And if they don't enjoy it, then they're not going to do it as well as they could have done. Whereas if you did support them in their natural talents, then the chances are they're going to become better at what they're doing because they have an inclination, a predisposition in some ways towards it. It's similar. I'm not saying it's the same, but it's similar with practice and the way that practice develops, because it is the outcome of the interaction with a group of people. It's social. So you need to be able to see how that social collaboration produces a form of practice which takes on a life of its own. So this is the argument for saying, well, you know, let's try to take a step back and allow it. But there's a counter argument to this as well. And the counter argument is that we need dialogue for many things, right? Dialogue is something that we need. We don't just do dialogue for the purposes of doing. Now, some people may, like you guys are here to talk about dialogue as a dialogue studies. You want to talk about it. You want to get a certificate for it. You want to understand it. You want to go into academia. You want to become PhD students in dialogue studies. You know, you want to bring together world peace. That's fine. But okay, hold on. What about world peace? So if we said, right, I want to instrumentalize dialogue to bring about world peace. I want people I want to resolve conflict. So you have conflict resolution. Conflict resolution has its objective in its title. What is the objective of conflict resolution, guys? What is it? I'm seeing eyes that are heavy. I'm seeing heads that are heavy. Are you guys sleepy? What's the aim of conflict resolution? Speak to me, people from afar. What is the aim of conflict resolution? It's a simple question. It has the answer in it. Mushtaq, what is the aim of conflict resolution?
Yeah, to basically resolve the conflict.
There you go, man.
Make both antagonistic parties to come to the table to resolve it.
There you go. See, it's
through non-violent means.
Wonderful. Well, very well said. So there is an aim in conflict resolution. So if conflict resolution wants to instrumentalize dialogue, I mean, we can't really blame it, can we? Because it's a lofty ideal. You know, you want to resolve the conflict. And how do you resolve it? Through dialogue. So what about not instrumentalizing dialogue, not making dialogue effective? You know, so it's a bit rich to say that we shouldn't instrumentalize it. You know, the dialogue plays a role in de-radicalization. We produced a paper in 2009 called De-radicalization by Default, the dialogue approach to eradicating violent extremism. And the argument that we were saying is that if Muslims, and this was something particularly aimed at Muslims at the time, so I'm not suggesting that only Muslims are extremists, of course they're not, and even saying that sounds silly, but the paper in itself was in response to a government policy called Prevent, and Prevent was focused on de-radicalizing Muslims by and large. And so what we were saying is that you can't resolve this problem head on. So you can't say, okay, I'm going to go and get ISIS and I'm going to just de-radicalize them ideologically. I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to get imams. There were programs like this. I mean, you can do that, but there are so many problems associated with that. And so what we were saying is, in fact, some objectives need to be achieved, not directly, but indirectly. In other words, how do you resolve extremism, the ideological aspect of extremism? There are some things that you can do directly, but if you create this massive machinery to defeat the ideological component of ISIS, right? It just feeds into the martyrdom complex of ISIS. They don't care, or Al-Qaeda or any other extremist group, they don't care how big the machinery is that exists to defeat them. That feeds into their end of days eschatological teachings. That's what they believe it's going to be. So they don't care about that. It feeds into their martyrdom complex. It also is self-defeating. I mean, you've got a British semi-secular Western Christian country, state, giving money to Muslim organizations to project a sanitized version of Islam. I mean, come on, that feeds into their narrative. So, you know, there are things you can do, but this is not going to be defeated head on, right? So what you need to do, in fact, is you need to take an indirect approach. This is what we were saying. You need to put something out there that as a byproduct produces the outcome. And one of the things that we were suggesting is dialogue, saying, you know, if people in community and society, if we can promote dialogue as the acceptable paradigm, right, then within all communities and within our culture generally, right, then you're less likely to have people to believe that their religion dictates them to go out there and fight people. It's if you believe that your religion requires you to engage in good relations with your neighbors, right, to be good citizens and to engage with people who are not of your faith or your background, to respect diversity, as I believe personally that Islam requires us to do. I believe that the diversity of faith in the world was God intended and is God sustained, right? It's God intended and God sustained. So if that in its own, if that is a principle that we can espouse, and if Muslims, as being part of this community in the UK, if they believe that, there's no way that they can be radicalized while they hold on to that opinion. So all we should be doing, this is the argument that we were making at the ideological level, is to teach and to promote dialogue as the paradigm, as the prevailing paradigm of our communities and societies. And every community can take an aspect of that, and Muslims can take a theological aspect of that. And the byproduct of that would be to inoculate, let's use another immunization terminology, to inoculate people against the violent extremist ideology that claims an Islamic justification. So that's what we were saying. So look, I mean, what have I done here? I've taken dialogue, and perhaps I've turned it on its head, and not just we're sort of instrumentalizing its byproduct here. So we're not just instrumentalizing the main thing, right? So we're instrumentalizing it, the thing that you throw away from it, the byproduct of it, and I don't think that we can say that we shouldn't be doing that. But coming back to what we said earlier, we have to be aware of where we draw the line. We have to be aware of how this impacts the overall aim of dialogue. So thinking about this, right? How are we doing? How is everyone's, some of the cameras are off, some of them are on. Are you guys all happily engaged? It's very difficult to do Zoom talks because I can't see you and I can see some of you, but I can't feel the vibe in the room. So forgive me if it's if you feel that it's not sufficiently engaging. But look, this is where you need to help me, Ziaul Hassan and Moeen. So if you don't feel that what I'm saying is relevant or you disagree, then please jump in. And you know, the irony is that a lecture on dialogue is a monologue, you know, in some ways, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so what does all this mean? Okay, who says, somebody said something?
Yeah, Dr. Ozcan, may I?
Yes, of course, yes.
This
please.
is Deepthi. Yeah, actually, I teach at a management college. So whatever examples you have given so far, I'm able to relate very well. The last 2-3 years, we have been trying to make dialogue as a pedagogical tool in the classrooms. I'll just share one experience of what we have faced. One of the batches which has used dialogue as a classroom process, when they go for the final placement, they are all in that zone. Like it's not like in management. There's always the zero-sum game. Like somewhere somebody has to lose for the other to win. So, but those who went through this process, I think my video is poor. So, yeah. So those who went through the process actually were very understanding and would allow others to talk about it. But it didn't happen with the other batches. Since they were combined batches sitting for it, it became a fish market. So these students used to come back to me and ask, see, you trained us in the dialogue process, but look at what we are facing. the others are jumping in, they don't understand the process. So unless this becomes a common ground everywhere in the college, this no, it's very difficult for us to sustain. So these are some of the things, like, no, we are having a issue over, because we used to take them through the process of mental models, trying to make them understand the process of listening. And Yanklowitz and I think William Isaacs, David Bohm, all these were some of the readings that they went through. And after years of, like, no, at least few months of practice, they are able to get to some level. But when they are getting along with the others don't understand it. So these people, when they are quiet, they are run over. So ultimately in management, it's always the one who talks gets the, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I relate to that. And in this country, we have an adversarial system. Like in court, it's adversarial. In politics, it's adversarial. I don't know if you watch the Prime Minister's Question Times every Wednesday, I think it's at 12, where in some ways it's wonderful because you get to the crux of the matter by debating. But there's also a problem with the culture of debate. And you know, the Prime Minister that we currently have, Boris Johnson, the previous one, David Cameron, the Eton graduates, Oxford University graduates, and they were members of the debating society. And being a member of the debating society in Eton, there's a certain culture associated with that. And that is the ability to debate about a subject without having any thorough substantive understanding of the subject, and without having any actual emotional or intellectual loyalty to the point that you are debating and defending, right? So there's articles about what does that do to our leaders. We've got leaders today that don't necessarily have strong convictions about what it is that they want to do, other than the fact that they want to do it. But why do they want to do it? They can't tell you. This was one of the big problems with David Cameron. Why do you want to become the Prime Minister of this country? Why are you the Prime Minister? What is your, you know, the substructure of your mind and your habitus, your thinking? I'm sure he has a habitus, that's inevitable, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But what are your values, and how does that prescribe? And so you get to a point where people are in fact just debating and talking for the sake of talking and debating. And there is a problem with that, because the process of dialogue is also about, and we'll move on to that in a moment, but it's also about understanding yourself, right? So dialogue is not just about understanding the other, it's about understanding the other, but in the process of understanding the other, also formulating our own beliefs and understandings, and understanding where we come from. And so, because that can only happen when you're open to the position of other people. And the reason for that is because we, as you know far better than I, we determine our place in the world by looking at the place of other people. You know, where am I? I used to think I'm a very calm, collected, tranquil person, until I met a friend of mine, you know, who was actually genuinely calm, tranquil. And I realized that I'm not like that, right? I mean, it's just my disposition. So we can only know where we are in comparison to others. I've looked at Christians and the way that they pray and felt an inspiration to pray as a Muslim. You know, so there are so many things that we learn and we take from other, but it requires a degree of openness. We need to be open. And this thing of talking and debating overshadows our ability to engage in reflective and reflexive engagement. And that's really the key here. And, you know, if anything, dialogue has a place in debates as well, because it can be disarming. You can have somebody talk and say all kinds of things, and the person can just stand up and say, right, okay, so this is what you mean. Let me Iron Man. I don't know if you know this term. It's a bit popular here. I don't know how it is. There's the straw manning, which is to take somebody's argument and to misrepresent it, to make it look weaker. But then there's a term that I don't know how popular it is. It's called Iron Manning. You know, so you take somebody's argument and you present it in the best way possible, right? You actually listen to what that person is saying, and you present it in the best way possible. That can be disarming, because in debates often we try to do the opposite. So if you were quite shrewd, you would take an approach that is less, a route that is less taken, even in adversarial efforts, and that would in fact, you know, make you dialogue would make you a better debater in that way. But coming back to the point that we were making here, so if we're thinking of dialogue in these terms, you know, can we make it effective? Can we not make it effective? What that really tells us is that dialogue, in fact, has three elements to it, if you like. So you've got dialogue, which is a medium to an end. It is a vehicle in itself, right? It's not that I'm instrumentalizing it. It is just that. So we can hear we're talking of dialogue, or you have a course called dialogue studies. So you're making it an objective. So you take it as an object. It's like grammar. If you want to study grammar, you are studying the spoken and the written word and the correct formulation of the spoken and written word. That is what grammar is, the study of language. But there's also use of language. You then go to the grocery and buy an orange, right? There you are not fixated on the grammar of your, well, you know, especially if you're a native speaker, it will come instinctively. So you are using language as a means to obtaining what you want, the orange. Whereas, or the apple, whatever it is that you're inclined to. Whereas the study of it is different. So you have here already, we have dialogue as a medium, but also dialogue as an object of study. But then the third, and perhaps this is what we were talking at the beginning, you have dialogue, which is sort of in a more purist form. And this is where dialogue is a medium, but it is also more purist. Yeah, so you want to understand for the sake of understanding. And this is something like education. So we go to education, we get our degrees. What do we do this for? So you can have degrees that are more career focused. So doing a law degree or doing accountancy at your degree level, a bachelor's level, is focused on obtaining a degree to be able to obtain a career often. But, you know, what if you were on an island, stranded in the middle of the ocean, and, you know, you had no prospect of future life. You didn't know if you're going to live because you're on your own. And you had books there. Wouldn't you read? Wouldn't you educate yourself for the sake of education, for the sake of learning? You know, isn't there an intrinsic value in that? And so this is the more purist, if you apply that to dialogue. So you have dialogue, which is the purest form, if you like, in some ways. I'm not sure if that's the correct way to define it, but here we are engaged in dialogue for the sake of dialogue. We are engaged in dialogue for the sake of developing our understanding of one another, regardless of the outcome of what that might mean. And that includes our inability to understand each other. So to engage in dialogue, and if that process leads to us actually understanding that it's very difficult to engage in dialogue, or if we understand that there's certain things that inhibit this dialogue, that is also a level of understanding. So that includes that. So that's more purist. Then you have, as I said, the use of dialogue as a medium, as a language, as a tool. And then you have the study of dialogue as an object, as in the form of dialogue studies or grammar. So this is what, you know, the reflection so far sort of appears to distill. There's another issue about restricting dialogue for dialogue, though. So coming back to sort of hitting that purist thing on the head a bit more, and that is the term that I used, habitus, which is a term introduced by Pierre Bourdieu. It's a French name. I'm never sure that I correctly pronounce it. He's a French great thinker, sociologist, who talks about this issue of habitus. And habitus is the mindset that we have. It's the thing that structures the way that we think about other things. It is our dispositional reflexes, our mindsets, our sensibilities, but it is the main building block of that, if you like, habitus. And it is a play, I think, on the word of habit, but it's more than that. And what Bourdieu says is that he says that life is full of fields. So studying is a field, working is a field, politics is a field. Being a shopkeeper and dealing with customers, advancing your financial situation is a field. Life is full of these various fields. And what you do is you participate in that. And when you participate in that field, you internalize the habitus of the field in which you are participating, right? So if you are a peaceful, loving social movement engaged in dialogue and education, and then your participants go and start to work within the Turkish state, right? What happens is, after a while, your participants will internalize the habitus of the Turkish state. So if the Turkish state has certain xenophobic reflexes, if it is very centrist, if it is discriminatory in its practices, if it is overbearing, domineering, right? if it has a certain narrative on the Armenian genocide, your participants will start to, participants that belong to or have a sympathy for a civil society decentralized movement will start to internalize the habitus of the place that they are participating in. Why? Because participation is a form of practice, and practice is very powerful. We don't realize it. We had the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in 1994, I think it was. This black boy was killed in the street, and the police completely botched the investigation in many ways, deliberately, it appears to be. And the commissioner who led the investigation, I think it was the commissioner who led the investigation into that, he concluded that there is institutional racism within the Metropolitan Police Service. In other words, that racism is so ingrained within the fabric of the institution that when you start working there, it becomes a part of your fabric, right? It takes on, it doesn't matter, you may be somebody who has great values and ideals, your parents may have raised you to be very loving and caring and open and so forth, but you're not in your parents' home there. You are now participating in something. You're doing your work, but you're picking up these cues of the place that you're in. It's why it's really important to look at our lives and to see where we are and with whom we are engaging and where we are participating, what the fields that we're participating in. And this thing happens at the pre-reflexive level. So you're not thinking about it, it's just happening. So when you go into a supermarket and you see a queue, what you do is you line up with the queue. That's simply what you do, because that's what is being done in that place. You internalize that, and then you internalize the logic behind that. And you do this, as I say, without necessarily thinking about it. It operates at the pre-reflexive level. Now, dialogue is a form of practice, as we said at the beginning. So when you participate in dialogue, you internalize a dialogic habitus. What is a dialogical habitus? Well, it's not easy to define because it's pre-reflexive. Remember, here we've got explicit knowledge, explicit know, what we know, and here we have tacit knowledge. So if I said to you, Shabista, can you ride a bicycle? Do you know how to ride a bicycle? Can you ride a bicycle? It's not a trick question. Yeah. Okay. Can you explain to us the dynamics of riding a bicycle? How do you ride a bicycle without falling off?
Means you have to manage the pedal,
How?
balancing the wheels.
What does balancing mean? What do you mean by balancing?
Means you have to put pressure on the the ground properly, so you'll not fall down.
So if you put pressure on the ground properly, you won't fall down. So if you just pedal.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else want to give it a shot? You didn't say anything about the steering.
But we have to move. We cannot stay in the same position.
So you need momentum.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But is that it?
But regular practice is much more essential.
Yeah, but I know. But if you had to explain it to an alien,
yes,
from Mars, you know, we're trying to go to Mars. How would you say? Just pressure on the pedal? Do you think what's going to happen to that alien if he takes your advice? He's going to fall off because you didn't say anything about the steering wheel. What happens about the steering wheel? How do you balance on the steering wheel? Seriously, how do you balance on the steering wheel? What's the steering? Not the steering wheel, the bar, the handles of the bicycle. What do you do with that? It's difficult, isn't it? Go on.
So my daughter has recently learned cycling. So I paid a little attention. So how she was managing.
Who are you? There is a voice that is coming from Ghaib, as they say in Arabic, from the unknown. Who is this? Said. Okay, Said. How do you explain to me, Said, what you do with the handlebars of the bicycle?
So I was watching her cycling. I noticed that she was, whenever the bicycle inclined to fall that way, she was steering that way so that it kept the balance.
Right, that's very good. Have you studied I don't know, engineering or something? Do you have an engineering background? No? No, it's very good. Look, that's very good. So, but look, number one, that's true. So to avoid falling off, you need to steer into the fall. That's the way to explain it. So you will have a slight tilt to the left, and you steer the handlebar ever so slightly to the left or to the right. Now, why have I asked you this question? The reason I've asked you is almost all of you know how to ride a bicycle, right? It's tacit knowledge. You have tacit knowledge. It's bodily knowledge. It's in your body. It makes sense when you're on the bicycle. But when I say to you, explain it, which is explicit knowledge, it's very difficult to verbalize it. So we know much more than we know we know. That's what practice does. Practice produces tacit knowledge that resides in our body, that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of reflexivity. When does it become explicit knowledge? It becomes explicit knowledge when I just did what I did. Somebody forces you to think. Hold on a second, how does this work? So somebody just said, just cycle, it will happen. Well, you fall off. Now somebody else said, well, do something with the handlebar. So now you're thinking and you're trying to bring it up here. Now, similarly, dialogue produces, and different dialogue settings produce dialogue habitus. The dialogue habitus in London may not be the same as the dialogue habitus in the part of the world that you're in, but there is a habitus associated with the field that we're engaged in, and that will reside, that is tacit knowledge, and that will shape and color the way we think and the way we look at things and the things that we do. So without knowing it, we will be instrumentalizing dialogue in other fields of life, right? And the habitus, our dialogue habitus, it's not just like a light switch. It's true. When we come into dialogue, we will think more in the terms of dialogue. So if we go to an interfaith event, we'll probably be operating according to the habitus that is there. And if we went into court and we had to defend ourselves, we'd probably be more adversarial, and we'd probably adopt the habitus associated with that environment as well. But these things are not things that we can just turn on and off, partly because we don't know when they're on and when they're off. So they will start to bleed into each other as well. Okay, so you can't stop it. And to think that we can somehow separate dialogue from things that we do in our lives other than dialogue, and to therefore not instrumentalize it, I think is perhaps too far of a claim. Right. So how are we doing for time? Whoa. Is that how are we doing for time, Chair?
Oh, it's coming to 53 minutes. So
I think we've had an expansion of time. It says, according to this, I've been speaking for 50 minutes, but does it feel like that to you? Does it feel like that? Abdul Kalam Azad, I realize, Abdul Kalam, you were standing very still until now, which therefore meant that the image behind you, which is, I think, it's not real. It looked like it was real, but then you started to move, and I realized that the bookcase behind you is in fact effect. I think it's a zoom effect. Is that correct?
Yes, the first one.
Okay, very good. Look, so I'll try to wrap it up, and then we can move on. And as I say, if you want to ask any questions in the meantime or make any objections, that's fine. But the next point, I said I had 4 sections, and we've covered the first one. But the other 3 are a bit shorter. So one other thing about dialogue is the cross-cultural fertilization and self-awareness that we alluded to earlier. And I want to expand a bit more on that. And this goes again to the instrumentalization and the effectiveness of dialogue. There is a term called cognitive compromise. I'm just looking for the book. There you go. It's in a book by Peter Berger and Anton Gisdeveld. It's called In Praise of Doubt. It's quite a nice sort of shortish, almost 200 pages book. And in there, there's this nice term that they refer to called cognitive compromise. And what they say is that when people come into interaction with each other, so dialogue produces social interaction. As I say, if we break it down into its practices, what is dialogue? It is social interaction. It is coming together. It is sitting, talking, listening, eating, traveling together. So it's an interaction, okay? And what they say is social interaction produces a relativization and a moderation of our own views. Because as social animals, we want to conform with wider society, but also we want to conform with each other. We have an innate predisposition to try to conform. That's why when we say, okay, somebody say something, often everybody remains quiet because everyone else is already quiet. So we try to conform with the norm, whatever that norm is. And this goes back to, I don't know if you've probably heard of the Solomon Asch 1950 line experiments. Have you heard of these? It's on YouTube, you can watch them. So
Yes.
you all know them, yeah? So they draw a line, there's 10 students, one comes in, the other 9 are a part of the experiment. And they ask the student how long the line is, they compare it with other lines. And the control subject first says the right thing, and then the other people who are all in this test, I'm just explaining if in case anybody else hasn't. So there's 10 people, one of them is the control subject. The other 9 are all in the test. They're all part of the test. So they show them one line and they ask them, how long do you think it is? And they ask him to compare it with another line. And everyone says what they think, and they all give the right answer at the first time. And as they do these experiments on again and again, this time everybody else in the group starts to change their answers. So they start to say, they start to give false comparisons. So they say, is this line, is this pen and this pen, is it the same length? So yes, it is. But then they go, okay, are these the 2 same length? And then 9 of the people in that group say, yes, they are. So what they do, and then the one control subject, despite seeing that they're clearly not the same, these are not the same, this is not the same length as this, it's very obvious, that person changes his answer. You can see visibly the control subjects, the men and the women that take part in this, they're uncomfortable, they're confused, but they all conform, or predominantly they conform with what the rest of the group says. So they say, actually, yeah, okay, yeah, I can see maybe it is. So we've got this, and this is where the social conformity theories come out, and that has been tested over and over again over the years. But that says something about cognitive compromise. So when we engage in social interaction with other people, inadvertently and pre-reflexively, it does something to what we are thinking. It changes the way we think ever so slightly. We may not be aware of how it is. And again, another example is body mimicking. So when you stand and you're talking to another person, you often, if you're talking to another person, that person is sat like that, you would probably come in and you're talking to him, you probably go like this as well. Or if that person is doing this, you may do that as well. And that's subconscious body mimicking. Is because if you mimic the other person, you subconsciously think that the other person is more likely to listen to you and to like you. Okay, so this comes back to the relativization. So unless we have strong reservations about an opinion that we have, when we share opinions with other people, our opinions are moderated and relativized. Even where we have cognitive defenses in place, where we think, okay, I'm right on this topic. When you talk to one person and they disagree with you, it chips away at your confidence on that. And when you talk to another person and they disagree with you, subconsciously it chips away at your confidence on that opinion. And this happens in time and slowly, but it nonetheless happens. It's a bit like the second law of thermodynamics. When you open the door and you have one room that is hot and another room that is cold, you get this equalization of energy. So the energy will flow from one room to the other. Fethullah Gülen, who I think you've already referred to in your talks, he talks about dialogue being the buying and selling of goods at a market. So you have a stall, you have your goods there, people come and buy from you, you sell. So there's an exchange of ideas. This is happening at the pre-reflexive level, without thinking. That's the point. It happens at the reflexive level. So Behzat might say something, or Zual might say something, Ziaul might say something, and I might say, or Maryam might say something, and that might make me think, okay, actually, this is a good idea. I used to think like this, I can change my idea. But what I'm more interested is at the pre-reflexive, the one that we are not necessarily controlling. So that's one point about, it creates a cross-cultural fertilization at the pre-reflexive level, dialogue does, because it creates social interaction. Social interaction also causes us to recognize ourselves in relation to others. As I said, we know what is big by comparing it to something that is small. We know what is progressive by comparing it to something that is conservative or status quo. So as human beings, the way that we think in patterns, and we think through comparisons. So to know ourselves requires us to have a knowledge and grasp and understanding and an experience of other people, because we stand somewhere in that spectrum. So it is a way of also recognizing ourselves. So the better that we understand other people, the better that we are likely to understand our own selves in relation to them. But it's also another outcome of this. And again, these are happening pre-reflexively. So I'm not saying you do this knowingly. You do this actually unknowingly in many ways. Another thing is social interaction breeds empathy, because you're now, if you do it dialogically at least, so if you're dialogically engaged in social interaction, it brings about empathy, because the effort is to be able to stand in the shoes of others and to see the world through the lens and the prism of others. But that also brings about a humanization. So you're humanizing the other because you are accepting that you can stand in his or her shoes, right? You're looking at the world through his or her lens. That is a way of humanizing other people, but it's also a way of humanizing yourself as well, to recognize, because what you then realize is you could be talking to a Christian or a Jew or an atheist or agnostic, you know, as I said, our militantly atheist good friend, and you realize that you share the same despair, the same love, the same care. Like, this person is a loving father, a loving husband, a loving human being. So you realize that actually a lot of what you share is not because of your religion or your culture or your background. It's because of your common denominator. That is that you are human. He is human, you are human. And therefore, despite the fact that you have absolutely divergent opinions on certain issues of faith and God, in fact, you have a common base, and that is your humanization, the fact that you are all human. So there is this humanization that occurs and accrues from that. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of this so that we make it for time. Right. Now, there's one thing about becoming a dialogue movement in that panel series. How can we become a dialogue movement? And this, I want to bring some of the problems with dialogue. I want to talk a bit about that, and then we'll sort of draw it to a close. So the social movements are defined as a specific form of collective mobilization which engages conflict by means of unconventional forms of protest. This is the definition offered in the publication. There are more academic definitions, but often it is a collectivity of people who've come together around a common cause, and they engage in some form of conflict to put forward an unconventional in terms of what the political discourse is, or the political dominant structures are, through protest, right? So that's the common definition. There's a number of problems here for dialogue straight away. Number one, dialogue is not about conflict. It's not about surprising people. It's not about organizing things to be able to wrong foot. It's about honesty. It's about openness. It's about, you know, trying to understand the other. So the conflictual nature with social movement definitions, and dialogue has a problem there. But then the definitions of social movements has a problem. So we have to accept that the definitions of social movements derived mainly from the American Western European context, the North American Western European context, and it was predominantly based on the examples of social movements in the 1960s and 70s. And as a result, it excludes, by and large, social movements that have a religious or a philanthropic or an altruistic purpose. So there is a problem with the definition of social movements. But the other thing is the issue. So these social movements have a purpose, they have an aim, they want to do something, right? And we've been talking about the instrumentalization of dialogue, and dialogue is not an issue like that. Dialogue is a method, at least in terms of you're thinking of it as a cause for a social movement. Well, it's not something you can tangibly buy. You can't go to the supermarket, and it's not about changing the outcome of a policy. So you have climate change, right, as a social movement. You have Greenpeace, you have other things, and they have very specific aims, and they have very specific requests and demands from government. Dialogue is not necessarily about that. Dialogue is about how those policies were formulated, rather than what the policies necessarily were. And so, you know, it's not something that you can turn into a topic, an issue, as most social movements do and have. And the other problem with dialogue is that, as I said at the beginning, it's not sufficiently exciting to a critical mass number of people. And you need a critical mass to create a certain movement, right? So there are people that are excited by dialogue, and here I'm referring to yourselves, who look very excited right now after having listened to a lecture for 1 hour on dialogue, on borderline sleeping, okay? But there are people out there who are far less excited about this thing, dialogue. So, and that's not because it's not essential. Bread and butter and oxygen are, you know, very important and essential. We can't live without it. But how often do we think about it? Okay, oxygen is not a good example. Air, because that goes into, again, Greenpeace, climate change, and, you know, global warming. But if you think of bread and butter and water and things that we sustain ourselves with, that's only something that becomes very animating when you recognize that you don't have it, and that's, again, a bodily recognition. Whereas dialogue is not, I don't think that we're at a level where we recognize dialogue to be a solution to our problems. So therefore, it's not something that animates us. And that's a problem of dialogue. Now, the final point was, and I'm not going to go into this, but it was about how do we then make dialogue exciting and relevant to the broader masses? How do we bring the disengaged? How do we bring the prejudiced? How do we bring the hostile into dialogue? Because if dialogue is just you, me, and the others talking to each other, saying, very nice, holding hands, singing, you know, hymns and hallelujahs and throwing daffodils in the air, that's nice. We can do that. But, you know, what is that going to do, right? What is that going to do to anything meaningful unless we bring people that have different opinions? So the people that we need to engage with, the disenfranchised, the socially excluded. And so really and maybe that is, so we need to think, do we need to reach these people? Is dialogue for everyone? Does everyone engage in dialogue? And the answer to that would be no, actually, in the purest sense, no, everyone should not engage in dialogue in the purest sense, because everyone would not be comfortable with it. But if we're talking of dialogue as a medium, as a means to doing something else, as a habitus, then yeah, we should try to include dialogue, because it is a form of social interaction, and social interaction socializes us, it humanizes us, it breaks down barriers, it makes life easier for us, it brings neighborhoods together. So there's it helps us to avoid conflict, it helps us to avoid problems in society. So yeah, dialogue is something that should encapsulate. But then how? How do you do that? So you need to make it to resonate. It needs to resonate with people. If it doesn't resonate, then it's not going to work. How does something resonate? Look, I don't know. This is quite a difficult thing. Now, there's something called, I don't know if you've heard this, right? It might come as a surprise to you, but there's something called TikTok. Do you know TikTok? That was a joke, by the way. This is called dad jokes, okay? At a certain age, when you have children, you make these very silly jokes. Anyway, I have come late to TikTok, by the way, but this is the thing that's gone viral. So there's this sticky ball, which is a luminous sticky ball. So in TikTok, the man throws the sticky ball to the ceiling. The sticky ball then falls down. The man then throws the sticky ball to the ceiling. The sticky ball sticks and then falls down. This has resonated with millions of people around the world. I don't know why. Maybe the millions of people are just looking at it and thinking something has to come out of this sticky ball sticking to the ceiling. Why are people watching this? You know, I don't know if everyone is just watching it with the same sense of bewilderment as I did, but it resonates. So this is the challenge, right? So if you think dialogue is important for people, then how do you make dialogue a sticky ball? How is it going to stick? What is it going to stick on? It needs to stick on something. And in PR, they say you need to take your message and you need to hang it on the hook. There is a hook. What is the hook? The hook is the current situation that people are interested in anyway, right? So right now we have the coronavirus, COVID-19. So how can we take that as a hook, right? So now we're instrumentalizing COVID. How do we take COVID as a hook and bring dialogue and hang it on there, like our coat? Because people are interested in COVID. They're worried about COVID. They're thinking about COVID. Now, this is PR, okay? This is PR strategy. But one way of looking at it from that point of view is to say, well, how do we then connect it to that? So if we can say, okay, dialogue will bring, there's social isolation, people are alone, people are dying from being alone. And in the UK, this is a big problem. A lot of people, the people die in their homes, they get discovered 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, because of the smell and stench. Now, let's imagine that you wanted to engage. Now, that may not be a problem in other parts of the world where we have different social dynamics, but it is a problem in the West. So you may think, okay, so how do we do this? Well, maybe we can do Zooming. We can Zoom with Londoners, with UK residents who are alone. Mushtaq can say, look, I want to talk to people in London, I engage in dialogue with them, and my aim here is to alleviate their their loneliness and to bring about some dialogue with them. You know, I don't know, you know, so this, but I imagine this is a big problem in this country and in the West growingly. So you would then take something like that, you would then attach it to a problem that currently exists, and you would show people how it helps. Education is another problem, right? So that may be another way of doing it. But really, I think, and this is what I've said to my current director of the Dialogue Society, we need to make dialogue a bit more exciting, and we need to take more risks. We need to reach out to people. And if what we're doing doesn't make you sleep a little uneasy at night, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but just like, you know, being excited about what you're going to do the following day. What's the point, right? What is the point, right? We need to, we either need to spend our time doing something that's meaningful, and if that's not dialogue, then don't do dialogue, right? There's no, it's not written in stone and granite that you have to do dialogue. What I think is written in stone and granite, at least as far as I can tell, is to do something meaningful with your life, right? So you can, though, take dialogue and make it meaningful, but that means taking risks. That means coming out of your comfort zone. If you're in your comfort zone and you're doing events around yourselves and your friends, that's fine. But you're not coming out and you're not engaging with the wider society of people. You're not doing what could be done. Do I have a textbook for what that is? I don't. I don't have that. And that nobody has, because dialogue is a practice, and you need to let that practice grow and develop. And what you can do as a practitioner is to help that grow and develop. Even if you're looking at this from an academic point of view, you need to be able to recognize, as I think I've tried to explain, that it is a practice that it can develop if we give it wings, if we give it some wind, if we give it some push, if we give it some effort, and to be able to reach beyond the conventional boundaries. Those, guys, are the reflections that came about from, I mean, this was, as I said, a panel that we had how many years ago? 10 years ago now. So I've just looked back on it. I've just tried to reflect on that. The publication is online, and there are recommendations at the end of that if you wanted to look at it, or you wanted to read it more thoroughly. And I think some of the videos might be on there as well on my website. But I've gone over 13 minutes, Bahsad, of my talk. So apologies for that.
Not at all. Thank you so much for this very engaging talk and thought-provoking one. Now we open the floor for questions and answers, or comments, of course. For anybody, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Speak.
Oh, I've just seen that there are some chats. Hi, sir, can you speak a little louder? I'm not able to catch your conversation. Oh, dear me. Was I not sufficiently loud?
No, sir, this is Sabiha More. I'm speaking from Mumbai. In the initial part, your mic was pretty low. It was almost at your neck level. So for 10-15 minutes, I was not able to hear you. And let me tell you, being very honest, English from Britain is a little difficult to catch as far as accent is concerned. So it takes some time for you to listen to it correctly, honestly, and then you are able to decipher the meaning. So that's why I wrote, it's
No,
me.
that's okay.
Yeah.
I apologize for that.
No, thank you. I know there's nothing to apologize. It was only that I was trying to be more concentrating on what you were saying. That's why probably I understood that.
Okay.
No, I don't know whether it's a comment or a question, but I'm into a profession where we train teachers. So we are into dialogues, because whatever is written on the pages of the textbook has to go across to the students. I mean, and without a meaningful dialogue, anything that you tell them is useless. You have to understand. But the problem with the student is that when we take a class, especially in the online mode, a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old doesn't seem to pay attention to what we are trying to say or we're trying to provide them. We otherwise also in a normal classroom situation, I think the distractors are so much that the dialogue does not become meaningful. What I'm trying to say that both the parties don't come on the same page, whether it is a classroom or whether it is a political dialogue or whether it is a social dialogue or whether it is a personal dialogue. I don't know why people don't seem to get the essence of dialogue. What are we saying and what exactly they are understanding? There's a vast difference between the two, and probably not coming on the same page makes dialogue meaningless, if I am allowed to say that. I don't know. You are supposed to be the director of Dialogue Society. I did a bit of research. I heard to your video lecture, which was available on the net last night. Since that's my way of looking at the speaker, I spent some time understanding, and I came to know that the political dialogue is also vain because nobody seems to understand. Look at India. A dialogue has to happen between a farmer and the government, and there have been almost 90 days on the street and there is no dialogue. I mean, where are we going? What is happening? I don't know. These were not the times. If we just try to just get you that there was a movement in Kerala called Silent Valley Movement where a dam was supposed to be built. People went on agitation. Indira Gandhi scrapped it. She said, no, we will not have this. You know, there is no dialogue happening. And why political? It is everywhere. I don't know what have you to offer me on this, but this is the scenario. This is what I feel.
It's a difficult one. It's not easy at all. And in this current day and age, in the digital world, where we have information overload, I mean, we have a processing system in our minds, and we can only process a certain amount of information. That hasn't changed. Our biological construct, our physiological makeup hasn't really changed. If you look at the IQ levels and the learning levels, there's nothing to suggest that we're more intelligent than our forefathers. There's nothing to suggest that. But the information overload, I mean, it's like we are an analog connected to the digital broadband. We're still analog. I mean, that it doesn't matter how big the pipeline is, it still needs to go through the bottleneck, and we are this is the bottleneck. And there is this huge amount of distraction in the world that is just, I mean, we don't even, it's like we're in a massive social experiment. You know, they do these pranks and social experiments online on YouTube. We are in a massive social experiment, experimenting with information overload, and in particular here, social media, and what this does to us mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and therefore dialogically, because all of that impacts our ability to engage in dialogue, is just incredibly difficult to ascertain. I was on the tube on the underground here, and somebody had their mobile phone, and on the back of it they had a sticker that said social media is harmful. It was a young person, had it stuck on the back. And I thought, you know, that's so true. It is harmful. There are harms to this. And if you look at the way that Twitter, for example, the feed, so you know, you scroll down. I'm sure you know, being in the profession that you are and others here, you know that this is connected to addictive behavior in casinos. When you go into the casinos and you play those machines, those games, you know, they roll. I don't even know what they're called. And then, you know, if they line up, you win, right? So the logic there is every time you pull the handle and the machine turns, you've got a chance of winning. It's the same thing. It's a scroll down. In fact, the person that actually came up with that, I think he was on YouTube talking about how he regrets, you know, he says it was inevitable. It was somebody, if he didn't do it, somebody else would have done it. But this thing of why are we scrolling down? Because there might be something. but and that's the same thing. It's that there is an addictiveness. So when you say something on Twitter and then people respond, you have a positive feedback loop. It is a manipulation of the dopamine in our minds, because when we have, even if it's a negative reaction, you know, who was B.F. Skinner, the applied behavioral, you'll know this, ABA. Yes. Yeah, it's controversial in this country. It's more accepted in the US. But ABA says that it was trained on rodents and rats, and the point is that it doesn't matter whether the response you give is positive or negative. Positive or negative responses are both responses. So, and they apply this to children. So when a children is crying, you deprive that child of both positive and negative reaction, because the thing that a child wants most is attention, and a negative reaction is attention. So, you know, they take these scientific pieces of research that are used to, in fact, for this or that reason, you know, whether it's useful or not is not, but the aim of ABA is to help make people more attentive, and to make children and to channel children's behavior. It's a children's management behavioral approach. And they use that in some ways to make children less manageable, if I can put it that way, and more distracted. And not just them, all of us. So, you know, this is not an easy question. I mean, that, as you suspect, you'll see, it's not an easy way of answering it. The only thing that I can say there is that it's the preparation before this happens. It's the preparation. So the habits that we try to create in ourselves and in the people that we work with do not occur on the day. So, you know, there's methods whereby you can say, right, what does this person like to do? Right, let me try to piggyback this other behavior on the back of that. So if they do something, they like to do a certain activity, can we manipulate that activity so that they can have a learning experience from that? Number one. Number two, you can prepare in advance. So you can I mean, how do you apply this for online Zoom? That's another problem. I mean, look, even doing this in the classroom is an issue. But, you know, before going into the learning experience, to try to prepare them, to calm them down, to help, to ask them to remove distracting objects, this in the classroom. That in a political setting, the way that you try to do this is you try to arrive early. You try to speak to the people that you're going to speak to in an informal setting. You try to set out what your position is. And all of this is actually not verbal communication. If you've watched any of my talks, I try to do this at the beginning, but it's not verbal communication. Most of the communication is informal and it's bodily. So they will see you, and if they see that you are humble, and if they see that you are attentive, if they see that you are courteous, then that immediately changes their response towards you. And so they try, as I said, that, you know, they mimic your body language, then they start to mimic the mode by which you're talking. So if you're talking thinkingly, reflectively, then they try to do the same thing. So that you know, it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that you need to embody. So dialogue, we need to think of dialogue not as I'm sure you already do. It's not a discourse. It's a bodily practice that is a cultural habitus that embodies us in terms of the way we think, the way we listen. And don't think that that doesn't have an effect. It does have an effect. As I said, cognitive compromise, it all chips away at people in certain ways. I was a very difficult student when I was 11, 12, 13. Very difficult to, you know, there's so many things going on in my mind. I didn't want to be in classes and everything. And I got kicked out of my high school on the basis that I would not pursue education. And I'm 42 and I'm still studying. I've just finished, I've submitted my PhD. So there's something that I took away from that school. Altruism was one of them. Selflessness was the other. But you know who I took that from? I didn't necessarily take that. I took that from people that were not trying to necessarily teach me instructively through lessons, but through their behaviors, through their care. And even if they were teachers that were trying to teach me science and maths at the same time, it wasn't the science and the maths that impacted me. It was their altruism and their professionalism and their volunteerism, which we can do as professionals. Professionals are volunteers as well if they embody that. And sometimes volunteers can become too professional if they embody that type of thing. So there are things that children take and people that we interact with take from one another. Let me bring it back to this militant atheist. We went on a trip, and this guy has, you know, he's very entrenched in his ideas, but he became emotional in one of our dialogue events. He was borderline crying. I mean, this guy, and he said it himself. He said, "Look, I'm having this emotional experience." He said, "I just spoke to my wife. She said she thinks that I've gone mad." But he goes, "I'm having this emotional experience here with you because it's just such a wonderful environment." So it's about, I think, you know, being able to be present with people for a sufficient amount of time so that they can see you as a person rather than just hear you. I know that this is not, you know, this is not necessarily easy tips, you know, do this, don't do that. But some of these issues are not like that. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't, if we put our brains to it, our minds to it, and we sat down, we thought about this, there are things that could be done in terms of an educational setting. For example, talk to the parents before you talk to the children. Ask them to think about the environment that the children are in, because as I said, it needs to be calm, it needs to be collected. If they've got their phones with their tablets with them and other devices with them, then the chances are they're not going to be focused on this. Secondly, try to make it resonate. Bring examples. When I'm talking to younger children, I bring out example. I mean, I'm sure you do this as an educator anyway, but I try to use terms and languages that they use so that I can, you know, and sometimes I make a fool of myself knowingly so that I can create a bit of a reaction, because a reaction is something, you know. So I don't mean to teach you teaching, I can't do that. But there's ways that we try to go into them and become a part of their reality. And I'm sure if we were to think about this more, we would be able to come up with more ideas. But it is such a struggle, and I've got a lot of empathy, because even doing this with professional people like yourself, it's not easy, because I can't engage the reaction. I'm hoping, I don't know where the technological advancements will go. Like, there's VR coming, virtual reality. I don't know if you've tried that. VR is something quite peculiar, because you can then perhaps see one another in a more organic form. It's not two-dimensional there. So I don't know where, when education will adopt that, but it seems as if we are going down a route where conventional forms of teaching are breaking down. So we are going to have to grapple with this question of dialogue in the classroom through technology. We will have to grapple. Maybe that's, Behzad, maybe that is something you as an institution would want to take up, dialogue in the context of classroom, in the context of teaching and technological advancement. Those three are converging. Okay, now, thank you. I think I don't, people should not feel compelled to ask questions if they don't want to ask questions or make comments. But if they feel to, I'd love to hear anyone's reflections on this, and reflections on dialogue in general. Look, you can say it's just among us. It's just the 50 of us here. Don't worry. So if you feel that this dialogue thing is not working, you must say it.
Abul Kalam Azad wants to ask a question.
Yeah, who is this? Where is he?
Hello, sir. This is Abul Kalam Azad from Bangladesh.
Hello, Abdul Kalam.
Hello, sir. Just I want to add one point actually. The thing is, before talking about the effective dialogue, how to, make an effective dialogue, just my point of view is the necessity of dialogue is day by day decreasing. Let's say, in October, there was a United Nations seminar, and all the countries, now they are sending their message through virtual media. This is one point. I'm saying that nowadays, even the chief of the state or the president, prime minister, now they're having meeting through online. They are not meeting to each other. Even as you were also mentioning, in Britain, the people are, all the things are being done virtually. The thing is, they are not talking to face. Also there nowadays people don't like to listen to someone for a long time. If you need to send your message or say something within a short period of time. That's I'm trying to say is the effectiveness of dialogue. Day by day it is decreasing. The dialogue between the people is just become virtual, and where the emotion, physical appearance, or everything is, as you know, not present. That's why people are not talking to each other so much in virtually. They're talking, but it is not formal. The type of dialogue is changing. Although we are talking about dialogue so many times, but the format of dialogue is changing time to time. That's what I want to add.
It is, and technology does create a problem, because dialogue, if it's bodily and it's a practice, it comes out through primarily social interaction. And what does social interaction mean when we have technology? But also, Abdul Kalam? Also, there's Clubhouse, this new application, and it's like, my God, everyone is talking in there. So you can, like, day and night, just jump into any room and engage in a conversation with people verbally, in there. So technology also provides us with opportunity. Look at us here now. So there's so many of us here. We're engaging and talking to one another through this application, through Zoom. So it also provides us with opportunities. But again, the dialogic habitus, right, is one of caring, affection, listening, attentiveness, trying to understand, taking the trouble to talk to people and to refer to them by their name, right? To smile. Now, you might think this is easy peasy, it's just hippie talk. It's not, because, and I'm sure you've engaged with people like this, you engage with people that have their own agendas, and they want to dictate their agendas to you. And a lot of people in this adversarial corporate setting are institutionalized into that kind of thinking. What's the pitch? What's the agenda? What are we doing now? There's a certain I can understand where that comes from. But in that context, taking the moment to pause and to just listen to people actually is quite meaningful. And you recognize people who have this approach when you are in the context of those people who don't, okay? And so there are ways to make that possible. So there's ways to take your everyday meetings and make it more dialogic. So you can start with a reflection. You can start by thinking about what people are actually saying. You can start by trying to listen to them, okay? But then you can also organize other things and other events that actually create that environment. You know, you can have a topic, you can have a talking object. This is what we used to do. So you would have a talking object, somebody would hold on to that talking object, they would say what they wanted to say, and that talking object would go around the room and people would talk about it. Or you can create cultural environments and events where you bring people out of their shell, okay? Because habitually people like to live and work and talk with people among their own background. And so you try to break that down by doing events. So there are dialogue events that you can do, and you can do this online again as well. But there's also, I think, and more importantly for me, I think, is to take the everyday practices, every day. So running a classroom can be didactic, but it can also be dialogic. Didactic is when you're just talking down to people, but it can also be dialogic. In Turkey, I was born and raised here, but I studied in Turkey for 3 years. All the seating is arranged so that you're looking at the blackboard, at the teacher. And they're all the same shape and sizes, all the tables and chairs. And the teacher walks in, everybody stands up, and then everyone sits down. Now you think about what that means. So there's a power structure. Immediately it's power. It's all about power. Everything is, and the classroom says to you, there is one right way of doing things. Why? Because all the chairs and tables are in one way, and they're all the same. And everything is facing the blackboard or the whiteboard. And when the teacher walks in, everybody stands up. He is the figure of authority. There's something about authority there. And when because I came from London and I was in a primary school here, and over here, it's about discussing and debating almost with the teacher. So you can say, I don't agree with that, sir. I don't agree with this. And the teacher doesn't go, oh, he didn't agree with me. How dare he or how dare she? Nobody says that. That's encouraged because learning happens through thinking, and thinking then can take us into different directions. So when I did that with an American teacher in Turkey, I said, well, I don't agree with that. And I was respectful and made my point. I was told off by the subsequent teachers that came into the classroom, okay? So there is something about thinking, well, how do I rearrange this room? Now, when I came back to London as a 14-year-old, I walked into the classroom and it was an art lesson, and all the tables and chairs were different sizes. I don't know if it was deliberate, but they're all different sizes. None of them were facing the blackboard. It was an art lesson. There was music playing in the background and people were getting on with their learning. And for me, as a Turkish, English, British, Muslim person, that created an identity crisis for me, because I associated that with Christianity. And I thought, well, look at how comfortable people are here. They're not enforcing an idea on people, on the students. They're encouraging the free flowing of ideas. This must be associated, as a 14-year-old, this is what I was thinking. This confidence must be associated with the Judeo-Christian culture. And the didactic form of memorization and learning, an authoritarian structure of teaching in the boarding school that I went to in Turkey, that must be associated with Islam. And so immediately I went into this thing. So you might look at that classroom and think, you or me, we might look at this and think, well, what does it matter what the size of the tables are? It matters in a way that we don't recognize. As I was trying to say, a lot of what we know is pre-reflexive. So we have to think, what does dialogue mean at the pre-reflexive level? So changing the tables around, if you're engaging in a dialogue, says something about the environment, and it says something to the person, and it says something about the culture that you are perpetuating in that school. So if all the tables and chairs are the same size, you're talking about the pre-reflexive message you're giving. And the pre-reflexive message that your students are getting is that there is only one right answer. And if the exam for the university is a multiple choice exam, it means that there is only one right answer. That then means that if you're standing up when the teacher comes in and sitting down when the teacher goes out, or when the teacher tells you to, that means that there is one authoritarian figure to tell you what the right answer is. Now, this is happening at the pre-reflexive level. So what I'm saying is a lot of the communication that happens with things of this nature is actually things that we're not speaking directly, but it's the environment. And so we can rethink about that, and we can think about that in a technological sense, in the way that, you know, Zoom and other things provide us, but in other settings as well. And it has an impact. I'm giving you an example from 35, 40 years ago. Well, not that, I'm not 42, so about, yeah, so about I'm giving you an example from 30 years ago and telling you how it affected me, right? So we shouldn't belittle that. And when I gave you that example of the bicycle, you know, we all know how to ride it, but we struggle with externalizing that, with explicating that. Our bodies, our minds, our thoughts, our emotions are shaped by the tacit world, the pre-reflexive world. And so we have to try to bring that out and think, okay, what does that mean for dialogue? It's not easy, as I say, and maybe, you know, what you're saying, you know, dialogue may not be the way to bring about the type of values that we want to be brought about in society. If there's something better, if there's an alternative to this, let's go for that. I have no loyalty to something for the sake of it. I think, you know, if it helps me to be a better person and to understand other people better, I think that's the way. There's this Amazon Prime Amsterdam, the new Amsterdam. Have you? I don't know if you guys have watched it. It's about a hospital in America who has a new medical director. I'd recommend that you watch it. It's on Amazon Prime. And this is a public hospital in America. And you know how the healthcare in America is quite terrible. But he's the medical director, he's the boss. But he goes in there, and this is the thing he asks. He says, how can I help? How can I help? And people are taken aback by that, because this is the medical director. He's wearing doctor's clothes, and he walks up to people and says, how can I help? How can I help the doctor in the A&E? How can I help the patient that's coming through the door? How can I help the receptionist? That's a very dialogic approach. It's very humane, it's very compassionate, it's very loving. And that's the question that we should ask, because a lot of people, when I was at the Dialogue Society, would come up to us and what they want us to write letters for them so they could become members of the House of Lords. We had people coming from embassies. The German ambassador's second political consul came up to us and said, can you put us in touch with politicians? So he wants us to arrange meetings, which, you know, I understand at a certain point, but everyone has an angle, right? It's so refreshing for you to go into a room, to go into a meeting with somebody and to say, how can I help? Right? And these you may think are small things, but in fact, the dialogue is about trying to understand what other people want, to understand them, and to think, how can I help them? And it shifts the paradigm. And as the world becomes more atomized, I mean, we're becoming enmeshed, we're closer together, but we're becoming more atomized, disenfranchised, and more egotistical. Everyone is about me, 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 me. You know, we've got one person in the real life, but multiple avatars on social media. To say, how can I help? And to talk and to take the mirror and to put it on other people and say, this is about you, is quite powerful. Okay, sorry, I've spoken too much. There's a hand here. Mushtaq is putting his hand up. Mushtaq, you have a real library behind you.
Thank you.
Not like Abdul Kalam.
I have one observation and one question. Okay. So my observation is related to the first part of your presentation, in which you spoke about the example of a friend being militant atheist, and he questioning the whole process of dialogue and if it's effective. So we have been regularly deliberating about this fact that is dialogue elite, and how much effective particularly dialogue is in bridging the divide between different communities. In this matter, I have one observation, particularly in the context of South Asia, where Hindus, Muslims, and other non-Semitic religions had existed for centuries, but due to the politics and other such issues, the subcontinent got partitioned. And after the independence of India, a huge chunk of Muslim minority still exists. The biggest minority of Muslims exists in India, and they have been regularly interacting with their compatriots, the Hindus, the other non-Muslims. But then Regularly, we witness that communal violence takes place between the two communities. So, what basic point I am trying to drive home is the fact that despite if you have interactions for centuries altogether, and even in case of Kashmir also, we had a Hindu minority that coexisted for centuries together with the Muslim majority. But in 90s, when the armed insurgency took place, so this Hindu minority had to flee from the valley. They migrated from here. So even if there are interactions for centuries altogether, a certain politics, a certain issue can trigger violence and can break down the relations that are the lived experiences. So how to overcome this thing? That it's a very important pertaining question, that even if we have been interacting with other communities, ethnicities, but then a certain small issue, a certain small political group is able to create a wedge that completely antagonizes the communities or different adherents of different religions. So that's one observation that we witnessed in South Asia, also in the form of partition, and also in Kashmir when the Pandit minority had to leave. And the question is related to the de-radicalization kind of thing that you spoke about. We witness that still, even among Muslims as well as non-Muslims or other in the West, we witness this mindset of clash of civilization kind of thing. Even among Muslims, we witness those who state that we don't need any kind of dialogue, or dialogue can't happen. It is a fringe element, but certainly it is available there. And other scholars who are trying to build the peace theology of Islam, or trying to go for a progressive kind of interpretation of Islam, they are being mostly labeled in Muslim majority countries, particularly in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and otherwise in the Middle East, as being Jewish agents, as being working for the West, and even in many cases they are being assassinated. So how to make this the radicalization kind of project that in a certain sense feeds, as you yourself very well stated, that those who are kind of motivated by this jihadi ideology, and also on the Western side who are basically the US, there we have the military industrial complex who need an enemy to fight with. So how to overcome this process? So that is basically.
Yeah, I mean, to do dialogue without saying dialogue. That's the thing. So because our discourse and our labels get in the way of the outcomes and the processes that we are trying to achieve sometimes. So we can engage in dialogue without calling it dialogue. As I say, some of the problems with the dialogue efforts is that it is conducted by a certain industry. Some of the problems with dialogue are the dialogue organization. So when you have a dialogue organization, the idea is that, well, the dialogue organization will do the dialogue. Okay, so what does the rest of the world do? What does the rest of the community do? Well, the dialogue organization is doing it. No, dialogue is like human rights. Human rights is everywhere and everything. You have rights to privacy, you have rights to speech, you have rights to family, you have right to work, you have right to education. There is no one topic of human rights. You can learn human rights as a discipline, but again, like dialogue, it has two forms. You can study it as an object like grammar, but it also percolates and relates. It relates in terms of rights, but it also relates in terms of values. So you can't be promoting human rights if you disrespect humans. One of the principles of human rights is to respect others, is to respect the humanity of others. So so there are certain values that underpin human rights, the rights espoused in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, right? So it relates to everything. And so if we said, well, human rights is one aspect of law, so we just put it into one category, okay? What about fair trial? There's human rights there. What about imprisonment? There's human rights there. Human rights is everywhere, okay? Now it has its, as I say, you can see it in tangible ways in terms of the rights that are espoused, but it also has an ethos. It also has a culture and values that underpin it. Dialogue is like that. So there's a problem with popularizing the dialogue discourse. There's a problem with not popularizing dialogue discourse. There's a problem with labeling our activities as dialogue, right? You can have an event called Debating Society and actually do it in a dialogic way. You can have a sports event Okay, where are the younger people? You want to involve the younger people with testosterone? Maybe the way to do it is to open a boxing club for dialogue, because studies show that where you have boxing clubs, violence in the immediate vicinity drops, because children and youngsters have a place to go and put out their energies, and you can do that dialogically. There's a way to do it. There's many people that practice this that actually don't recognize it. The problem is when you label it, you open yourself up to these kind of accusations that you're trying to create some kind of cross-cultural religion, that you are the agents of the West. You don't need that. We don't need that. Who needs that publicity? If that's not what you're trying to do now, you can, as I said, this purist dialogue with interfaith, intercultural, theological dialogue. You can do that with the priest, the rabbi, the imam, you know, with people of different faiths or no faith. That's fine if people want to do that. But the vast majority of people are not excited by that. So the idea is bring people together of different backgrounds in a place where they have common respect for one another. That's it. The dialogue, the pre-reflexive elements of dialogue will ensue. In some ways, this cannot be, or as I coming back to what practice is, you can't over-construct this and over-engineer this. You know, we have dialogue events that we were going to, and the dialogue happened on the bus to the event, not at the event, right? Because at the bus, everyone put their defenses down. Nobody needed to do a big show in front of other people. Actually, that's where the dialogue happened. And often that's what we find. Like, one of the ways to do this is when you organize something, you organize it with other people. So you convert the process, because if you look at these dialogue events, often most of the energy is exerted on the preparation. Right? If you're organizing a conference on dialogue, it takes about 12 months if you're doing a proper conference. And the event itself is a day. But 12 months, there's people working on calling people, inviting speakers, calling papers. So the smart thing to do, the managerial thing to do, right, is to convert the process into dialogue. So what do? You go and do it in partnership with other people. You bring other people into that dialogue. You have editors. You create these things so that people can partake in the preparation. So the 12 months of preparation for the event becomes a dialogue. So that even if the event didn't happen, God forbid, for some reason, you've already engaged in dialogue. It needs to look, the best dialogues are the stickiest ones, the ones that resonate, the ones that people see a value in. And we can't thank people for not seeing the value in dialogue in and of itself. If you're an academic, and some of you are, you have to publish papers to retain your tenureship at the university. They will look at your publication of papers, right? If you're a teacher, they will look at the grades that your students are getting. So if I want to involve teachers and students and academics in dialogue, I need to make sure that somehow it relates to them. It makes their life easier. If it doesn't, what's the point? Now we've got COVID-19, people are staying at home, they've got an uptake of divorce. People are getting divorced, right? Okay, so some people really need to get divorced, but some people maybe need some training in mediation, in understanding, in anger management and things of that nature. So if you have some kind of expertise in that background, then there's something that you can do to show them the value of this thing. Because if people see the value of it and it genuinely helps them, then they'll stick with it. So remove the labels. You know, you don't need to call it what it is. You just need to do the thing. You need to bring people together. Football is a great way. The gym, maybe I was saying the other day, maybe the gym is the place where we need to be thinking about, you know, maybe that's where we need to go right now. If that's where the younger people are and that we want to involve them in this process. And then eventually people will, if they see something valuable, they'll take it up. The other thing about, it's very difficult, the other point that you made, and it's true, politics can have an effect, but if you look at this thing closely, you'll often see that it's not one thing that happened, it's a process. So when these political events happen, there's also, like, if you look at the genocide and the Holocaust, you'll see that this is a process. It began in the 1930s with demonization, dehumanization, right? With the language, with the way that the Jews were treated, with the ways that they were depicted, and the internalization of that by the wider masses. And then you have, you know, the pogroms, and then you have other things that followed, and then eventually the extermination. So there's usually a build up to these kind of events. And that's where it's important that we analyze our own practices, the social practices. Politicians are not as powerful as we think they are, number one. religious leaders are not as powerful as we think they are. We often ascribe a lot of power to religious leaders. It's because of the power that we provide them. So it's the masses, actually the masses. There's a critical mass. What is it in feminist studies? They say that if I think it's the 30%, if 30% of a board meeting have female participants in there, or a mix of genders in there, it's only at that point that it goes beyond tokenism and they start to have real effect. And it's similar with other things in society as well. There's a critical mass of people that need to be, not everyone, it's not 100%, it's not even 50%, but if you get 20% or 30% of people inclined to a certain mindset and a certain way of thinking, then that has an effect on wider society. So Donald Trump, for example, did not create white supremacy in the United States of America. He did not create the polarization, the alienation. You've got to understand Donald Trump, you've got to go back to understanding Sarah Palin, who ran in the elections when, as the running mate of, who was it? The senator who passed away against Obama. She was the one that started this kind of rhetoric, but it's not her as well. If you go back, you'll see something else happening in American society. And it's only when you go back into that you realize where we are now. So these are processes, Mushtaq. They're not, I don't think that there are one-off events or that trigger it. And when you go back, you start to see that something was simmering, that maybe we were coexisting side by side, but not maybe together. I'm not saying that a very peaceful society cannot be turned against each other. They can. And that's something to do with our basic psychology. Hatred animates us more than I wouldn't say love, because love is quite intoxicating and borderline insane, right? People do insane things for love. Romeo and Juliet, you see that, but it doesn't. Hatred animates us in a way that love or care doesn't. If you have a bad experience, and Deepthi will tell us this in the business context, did I mispronounce your name? Deepthi? Yeah, is that?
No, correct.
That's okay.
Correct.
So if they say that if you go to McDonald's or any other restaurant and you have a bad experience, I think you tell an average 20 people. If you have a good experience, you tell 5. There's something about negative. Yeah, there's something about hatred that animates us in a way that positivity doesn't, and that's why the news is always bad news, because that's what sells, right? And that's we have a struggle there. We are starting the race at a very big disadvantage, and that is that all of these lovey-dovey messages that we're giving here are not exciting for the people as somebody else's messages of hatred, right? If Donald Trump was speaking here, there'd be reactions. And then if you get somebody else that's talking about peace and love and holding hands, it doesn't really do it. So our psychological makeup creates this issue. So we have to think creatively. We have to be bolder and more courageous in our thinking. And if you look at practice theories and methodologically, there's something called process tracing, which is quite useful, which is looking at cause and effect. And you'll actually find that the things that we think cause the effects are actually not the causes. There are things in between that. There are entities in between the cause and the effect. And once you start to zone in on that, you actually see that there are other things. And these politicians and these religious leaders often play on and pick up the tacit, emotional, pre-reflexive developments that are going in society, and they externalize it. That's why we attribute those things to them. Not because they created it, but they verbalized it and externalized it. And we think that, oh, they're the ones. And again, if you look in, product development, you'll see that there are people who are the first people that test products, and they're people that adopt, they're early adopters. They're not the same as the popularizers. Then you get a second group of people that popularize that thing. I think it was like Ugg boots. Ugg boots came out, it was sort of fashionable. It wasn't fashionable. It was almost going under. Do you know these Ugg boots? It's this certain type of boots. Women predominantly wear them. They're fluffy inside. It was a sort of a fringe thing. You had these early adopters that were wearing, and then you had a group of people that started to popularize it. They have a certain disposition. Now we associate the fashionability of that with those. We now call them social influencers, right? Social influencers. Social influencers do not create anything. They just take the things that we have within us. They see the developments, and then they put it in a way that we can resonate with. That's why we ascribe so much power to these politicians, whereas actually the power resides, it's going to be very cliche, but the power Mushtaq, resides within you. Okay, we have a few more minutes, Mahsad.
Yes, we have 5 minutes. If there's any question or comment, we can take. Otherwise, we can conclude here.
This is a very polite, courteous group. You know, it's very nice, but at the same time, nobody is contradicting. Well, Mushtaq did a little bit of that. Thank you for that. I'm grateful.
Mr. Ozcan, there's
yes.
actually nothing to contradict, I think.
Wow.
I mean, whatever you mentioned, like, for example, the stickiness factor, I think you have brought it in. I mean, I'm so glad that I didn't miss this session of yours.
I appreciate it.
The Mavins, I think Malcolm Gladwell it was who mentioned all these points, right? I was just looking at you, and like the way you had been able to pull us out into a conversation, that itself speaks for dialogue. And if we all could create it, I mean, it would be amazing.
Yeah, it could. And I mean, I have had good examples of people in my life as my teachers, and teachers are very important, you know, just to Sabiha's point. We, as I say, we don't often know. We don't know why we do a lot of the things that we do. But what we do know as academics now is that a lot of these things are shaped early on in our lives. You know, from 0 to 4 is really important, apparently. I remember picking up a book before I got married about marriage. And the first 3-4 chapters was about before marriage. And I thought, well, I've already missed it, you know, like what's the point of reading this book? Because the first 3 chapters are about what you do with your life before marriage. And I just got married at the time. And a lot of the way that we are is shaped by our early teachers, our parents, the people in our lives at the very beginning. And I'm, you know, some of that really comes from that and being in different environments. So I appreciate your taking part. Okay. Behzad, I think we can let's finish early. That would be a first for me. Okay, I appreciate it. I have a Viva in 4 weeks' time, so please keep me in your thoughts and your prayers. And if I pass that, I'd look forward to participating as a listener.
May I just add to this? Behzad sir, only 1 minute. My name is Sabiha, and you know I am named after that fighter pilot of your country.
Sabiha Gökçe, yes.
So I have an airport. I have an airport in my name. When I was born, my father was with his Turkish counterpart at ILO, and he said, "I've got a daughter," and he said that, "What is it that I can name her?" And he said that you name her Sabiha. By the time he came back, I was already Christian with a different name, but he came back and did the Hakika again to rename myself. So that is a meaningful dialogue. I want to end on that note.
That is
thank you very much.
No, thank you. That's a very interesting story. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay. Leave you in peace and take care, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Ozcan, for joining us today. I know how busy you have been of late, but and I'm sure everybody will join me in wishing you success in the upcoming PhD Viva. So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.